the panel for Saturday. We have a full day coming tomorrow, and then afterwards we can sleep and watch cat videos and relax. But for now, it's time to boil ideas in the noosphere. Okay, so on the occasion of the World Day to End Speciesism, we are here today um, for the Little Anti-Speciesist webinar is organized by Vegan Option Canada and and Animal Rebellion and Projet Méduse and Numbi Radio. So my name is Elisa and I'm founder of Vegan Option Canada, and today I will be your host. Today we are in presence of with an awesome activist whose name is Harley, and sorry, I don't want to mispronounce your family name. I'll let you pronounce your family name. Sorry, my first language is French, and I'm afraid I would not say it right. So, can you tell me what's your family name?
Hi, I'm Harley, McDonald-Eckersall. So a bit of a mouthful, but it makes me easily searchable, which is win and lose.
Yeah. So yes, we're with Harley. So Harley has hands-on experience as a story-based strategist, which is a new term that not everybody knows today, for Animal Rebellion, as well as someone who works on several issues with the Animal Think Tank. So Harley knows a lot about nonviolent civil disobedience, has been arrested in UK, and will talk to us today about stories and their way to shape narrative and further all to bring about social justice and social change for animals. So thank you. Last thing I forgot to say, this conference is recorded like the other ones. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a little time for a few questions, so feel free to write down your questions in the little box below, or you can wait until the end and just raise your hand and speak out loud to ask a question to Harley. So without further ado, I'm leaving. The floor is yours, Harley.
Thank you so much. Just before I start, just to clarify, should I click record on my end as well?
Yeah, if you want, we can never be too sure.
Cool. There we go. Hi everyone, my name is Harley. It's great to be here. I'm really honoured to have the chance to speak to you all. So I'm Australian. I'm living in the UK at the moment, and I've kind of my activist journey. I'm a full-time activist at the moment in animal justice and climate justice, but kind of everything started for me quite a while ago, and really stories have always been the center of what I do. And for a long time, and my mind's been ticking over, and I've been trying to think of like how we can talk about what we do better, and how we can create stories and use language that is going to make people understand what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it. So I think anyone who's been an animal justice activist, advocate, will have that experience of trying to communicate and just feeling like you're talking to a brick wall, and knowing in your heart, like what I'm saying is right, it's justice, it's true, but just not being able to communicate with that person, or doing an action and having a public reaction and just being like, well, that's not what we meant to say, it's completely off that's completely off what we were trying to say, but just not knowing how to break through that. So for a long time I've been grappling with that. This started back in Australia. So when I was back in Australia, I co-founded an organization called Young Voices for Animals. We worked with young people, and we did that because we didn't see an option for young people to get involved in the animal justice scene in a way that was non-violent and safe, but also really kind of moving towards a positive and hopeful vision of a future of animal liberation. So when we started to think about that, I really started to think about how are we talking about animal justice? And are we thinking about the words that we're using and the messages that we're using? And kind of through that, I went to a lot of different places. I read a lot of books, talked to a lot of people, and I kind of came across this whole area of work, and this whole kind of area of study, which is about framing and about the language that we use. And what I learned through this was that the political right is really, really good at this. They've been studying this for years. They have so much money invested in the very specific, down to the last, like, specific words that they use. Like every press conference, every news article, everything is shaped by the people in power to make what they're trying to sell and the kind of dominant worldview seem as appealing as possible. And when I realized that, it made a lot of sense to me, because I suddenly understood why these stories, which when you kind of dig down deep into them, the political right say, they don't align with our values, like as a society, as individuals, especially around animals, that, the kind of thing that we've all grown up with, that eating animals is nice, it's natural, it's necessary, and all that kind of thing. Like all of those are stories that are being constructed. And to me, that was like a really big understanding, was when I realized that they had been constructed, then I realized that we could also figure out how to deconstruct them. And the one beginning of that is in the language that we use and in the messaging that we use. To me, that was really powerful, because I realized that by telling stories, by using language, we can start to deconstruct all these myths in society that are propping up this industry and worldview of animal exploitation. So I want to start off, I'll be talking a bit about framing today, language, how we can think, like reframe the way we think about language, and how we can kind of swivel around and think about the way we talk about animal justice in a different way. And I wanted to start with a little activity. I'm not sure how many of you have a paper and pen in front of you. Let's see if people do. But if you do have a paper and pen, I would encourage you to grab it right now. And I want you to draw a beach. So a scene of a beach. So, just draw a square, do some waves, sun, beach ball maybe. I'm going to draw one. So one sec. I'll show you what I mean. This is going to all make sense. Okay, so now I've got a paper and pen. So now we can all do it together. Okay. And I'm a very bad drawer, so we can struggle along together with the drawing. Okay. The beach ball, an umbrella, some bathers, just having a good time on the beach. So I'm going to show you mine. If you're brave enough, turn on your camera and show you a picture of the beach. This is mine. There's the sun, there's a beach ball. Apparently it's a nudist beach, but it's just got some stick figures there, an umbrella and some ocean. Yeah. So hopefully some of you who have a paper and pen have your beach in front of you. But if not, you can follow along with mine. So, I'm back. So now we have our beach. I want to kind of point something out. So this is an image. And, it makes sense as an image. It's a beach. It looks like what a beach does. There's nothing surprising about it. There's nothing that will make you go, oh, that doesn't fit in. It's a beach. So now I'm going to draw a square. So imagine that square is all you can see now. And also imagine that I'm a good drawer and that's a beach ball. So now this is an image of a beach ball. It's still the beach, but it's an image of a beach ball. What does that is like, and think about that. That's a different story. Like it's a different, even though it's the same part of the same story. Like it's a beach ball on a beach, but when you put just a square around that beach ball, that's something very different. Now I'm going to draw another square. So now we've got the umbrella and two people under it. Again, same image, different story. Now we're thinking it's a story about these two people. They're doing something somewhere. We don't really know that it's a beach at this point. And then finally, yeah, I could draw a box here, and that's the sun. And again, it's a different story. Don't know what the story is at this point. We'd need some more clues. But it's not the same story as this whole image that we have here, which is the beach. So why I did that was to illustrate what framing is. So basically, when we have an image, that's a really, that's kind of an obvious thing. But we can also imagine that this image of the beach is an idea and that frames a language. So what framing is, according to George Lakoff, who kind of wrote the book on framing, which is called Don't Think of an Elephant, which I'll talk about a little bit later, potentially. So framing is about getting language that fits your worldview. It is not just language. The ideas are primary, and the language carries those ideas and evokes those ideas. So when I'm talking about framing, I'm talking about language that fits what we're trying to say. And I think the reason it's so important, or one of the reasons it's so important, is because we don't have as much power to frame our stories as other people in society do. So I used to be a tour guide in the city of Melbourne, and I used to do an activity with the people. So I used to go for walks with young, like high school students. We went around Melbourne and we talked about different social issues. And one thing that we talked about was who has the power to tell the stories in society. So we talked about this bank. It's a building in Melbourne. It's this big bank. And essentially, the bank has an address, which is on a street that used to be known for selling heroin, the street that the bank's address is on. So the bank, what they did was they bought a little strip of land to change their entrance, so then they could change their address. So the actual address of the bank is on this street, but because they didn't want to be associated with that, the name of that street that the address was on, they rented a little strip of land, which essentially changed their address so they could legally say that their address was a different address to what they actually are, to then not be associated with the bad image of that street. So stories are about power, and the powerful in society have the ability to frame their stories. And a lot of the time when we're fighting for social justice, we don't have that same kind of level of power to frame our stories, which is why it's so important, in my opinion, to understand what framing is, how what we're doing can be framed in a way we don't want it to be, and how we can kind of take some of that power back, even though we don't have the immense amounts of resources that maybe the kind of dominant society might have. So I'm going to expand a little bit on kind of what framing is, using some examples of those who do it really well, unfortunately, which is the political right. And this is again going into kind of some of what George Lakoff talks about in his book, Don't Think of an Elephant. So essentially, when an issue is framed, it's communicated in a way that sends a certain message. So something can be talked about in one way, which says, one thing using certain language, and it can be talked about in another way that says something completely different, purely depending on the language that's used. So an example that George Lakoff uses is the idea of like tax relief. I don't know if people have heard about this. There's something in the US that they talk about tax relief. So on the day that George W. Bush arrived in the White House, the phrase tax relief started coming out of the White House. And it is, and it still is, used a number of times, like, and it's still used to this day. So if we think about that, so basically those, like when someone like says something like tax relief, it's not just a random choice of words. It's been chosen to kind of send a certain message. So think of the framing for relief. For there to be relief, there must be an affliction. So an afflicted party and a reliever who removes their affliction and is therefore a hero. So politicians and political parties use certain language to kind of sell their ideas in certain ways. And this makes sense, you know, like it's all branding, it's all messaging. But until we kind of like, when we understand this, we can kind of see why certain ideas gain traction while other ideas don't. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit later. So again, like going back to that idea that framing is about language, but it's not just about language, because the ideas are central. And what language does is that it carries and evokes those ideas. So what language does is it connects to values. So what the political right do really well, it's a really good question. Yeah, we'll get to that, I'll get around to that in a second. Sorry, I'm just reading the chat. What the political right do really well is connect to people's values in the framing that they use. And another example of that is again from America, and again with George W. Bush, which was a so when there was a State of Union address, and sorry, I'm just going to get back to what I was talking about. Getting a bit off track because I get excited about framing. So essentially, yeah, when we're talking about framing, we're talking about language and the way language is used to kind of connect to different values and different ways of talking about an issue. So what I really want to talk about in this kind of session is how we can take some of that power, because as I've said, the political right are really great at using framing, and I could show you a lot of examples, but I think what I prefer to do is kind of get into a bit more about how we can use framing. And to do that, I want to jump into some talk about some discussion about what that might look like kind of on the ground when we're talking about actions and things that we do in the name of animal justice. So one key thing that I think is really central to the framing discussion is how we interact and how we respond to messaging and framing that's coming from, I guess, like a different point of view. So usually, you know, we think about it as like it's in kind of framing literature, it's called our opponent's frames. But when we're not using such, you know, adversarial language, we might talk about it as, you know, the dominant ideology or a point of view that's different from ours. So when we're talking about animal justice, this is really relevant because most of the time we're coming up against a system and a society that doesn't accept that animals deserve rights, let alone justice or liberation or freedom. So most of the time when we're doing actions, when we're communicating, when we're, you know, being like we're writing new ideas, whatever kind of action that we take in the name of animal justice, whether that's academia or grassroots organizing or any number of other things, we're coming up against people who disagree with us. And, you know, we're still a small minority and we're trying to build into this big movement of animal justice. So most of the time we are coming up against a system that disagrees with us. And I think one of the biggest things that I've learned from the research that I've done, and also the work that I've done in Australia and in the UK. So in the UK, I'm involved, I think, as Elisa said, with Animal Rebellion. and also with a group called Animal Think Tank. And in Australia, I've done work with quite a few groups who do kind of from grassroots organizing to lobbying to a lot of different things. And I think one of the biggest learnings I've come away with from the research I've done and from the work that I've done is that often when it comes to language and messaging, our instincts can only take us so far. So when it comes to being in the kind of minority position of being people kind of advocating for anti-speciesism, it's a kind of the tempting thing. And what I used to do a lot and what I see done a lot is to believe that our position is so strong that if we just show how right we are, then we're gonna change people's minds, we're gonna change people's hearts. And I think the way that it's tempting to do that is to kind of take what the other people are saying, so what society is saying, and say why that's wrong. Because I think everyone has most people would have had that experience of just hearing things about animals, about the way we use and exploit animals, and just knowing that it's wrong because we know science, we know kind of that animals shouldn't be used. So we hear things and we know that they're wrong, and the temptation is to just be like, well, that's wrong because of this. And most of the literature and framing has kind of really dug really deep into this, and they found kind of this key thing, which again, like I mentioned George Lakoff before, and his book Don't Think of an Elephant. The main kind of the idea in that book, the kind of central idea, is that when we negate a frame, we evoke that frame. So the activity that he uses to kind of demonstrate this is kind of a really iconic one now, which is that he asks students to not think of an elephant. So he says, don't think of an elephant. Whatever you do not think of an elephant. And he says in his book that he's never found a student who is able to do this, who is able to not think of an elephant when they're asked to not think of an elephant. And I think, a lot of people have probably had this either with language or, when you're told not to do something, and then it just becomes all the more tempting to do something. It's like, when you see a door that says do not enter, and it's just that instinct to be like, oh, I wonder what's behind that door. So when we negate a frame, we reinforce a frame. And George Lakoff talks about this a lot when it comes to political activism on the left, in that the left has typically spent so much of their time battling with the right and using, facts and figures and trying to prove that they're wrong because, they're not aligned with values. They're not aligned with science. And even though we've seen that the left has got values and science and justice on their side, a lot of the time they still lose. And kind of George Lakoff wrote his book to explore this phenomenon, to try and understand why the left wasn't really getting anywhere. And I think it really does apply to kind of the work that people do in animal justice and in anti-speciesism. Because even though we have kind of so much knowledge and science on our sides, it sometimes feels like we're not really getting anywhere. And I think when we think about that, and when we kind of look at this, look at what the research shows about framing, we can really kind of start to understand why that might be. So when I kind of think of I'm just going to give a little bit of a concrete example of what we mean about negating a frame and reinforcing a frame. So this kind of, when I was reading this work, something happened, which was just a really small thing, but it really reinforced this for me. So I was going for a walk, and I walked past a car wash on the side of the road, and it had a big sign out the front. And I'd just been reading this book, And I had just moved to the UK, and I was just starting up at Animal Rebellion and doing kind of different work there and trying to think about the language that we use and the messages that we use, and trying to understand how we could better connect and better kind of push a message forward. And I walked past this car wash and I saw the sign, and it said scratch-free finish. Like, you know, we will not scratch your car. And the first thing I thought was like, well, why do they have to say that? Like, I'm probably not going to take my car there because they've just, you know, maybe someone's complained that they got a scratch on their car. So now they're like, no, we definitely won't scratch your car. And it really kind of reinforced it for me of that. As soon as I saw that word scratch, even though it said scratch free, as soon as I saw that word, all it did was evoke the image of a scratched car in my head. And that kind of clicked home a lot of the stuff I'd been learning for me, because it's that idea that when the word is defined relative to that frame. So if someone creates a frame, and in this case, the frame was, you know, a scratched car being bad and stuff like that, when they create that frame and then you try and position yourself in opposition to that, what you end up doing most of the time is just reinforcing that frame, because you're evoking that image, you're reinforcing like neural pathways as they're being activated, and people are associating you with that. So, you know, if we, like, I think in like an example that came up for me was I was with a group of activists, and they'd just done a disruption, and there was a media article about it, and it was quite a negative media article. You know, the kind of typical stuff of like, you know, militant vegans and all that. And these people were like, well, that's not us. Like, they've misrepresented us. This is unfair. So what they did was release a statement saying, this is, you know, and quoting the other article and saying, we're not militant vegans, we're this. But all that did was kind of spark more discussion about how they were militant vegans and stuff like that. So what they did was, in trying to kind of refute the frame and go against it, they unintentionally reinforced it and kept that conversation going. So I think, yeah, it can be really damaging, because when we're trying to place ourselves in opposition to something, we can end up reinforcing it and making it stronger. So I guess that what comes up then is like, then what do we do? Because how do we tell our own stories, and how do we make our own friends? And that can be a really hard thing, because like I said earlier, we don't have as much power as these big as this dominant society. And I think like one thing to remember as well is that this is not a new concept for the political right and for a lot of groups and organizations and bodies and industries. Like, they have marketing teams working on their framing, and they have for, you know, decades. Whereas most of the kind of social change movements have been kind of growing from the grassroots for a long, long time. But, you know, it's volunteer run, doesn't have millions of dollars poured into a marketing department. But there are some things that we can do. And there's some really simple things that we can do to start trying to take this power back and shift the balance of power. And one of those things is to even just start this conversation. So start telling stories with our actions, to start thinking about the frames that we want to do. So I ran a workshop a while ago on using stories in actions, and it was a really great kind of thing to do, because we got people in there kind of talking about experiences that they've had creating actions and trying to, you know, how, like, you know, things have spiraled out of control, and try to figuring out how to, you know, when something hits the media and it's not what was intended, how to kind of respond to that. And this has happened to me as well, when something's, you know, been planned for such a long time, and then it's hit the media in a way that wasn't intended, and it's like, how can we avoid that? So one thing that we talked about was there's something that happens sometimes when you plan an action but don't plan a frame for that action. So don't plan a story for that action, which is that you end up spending more time defending your action than you did planning it. So there's a concept called action logic, which I'd really encourage people to look into, which is that the idea is that you have a message for your action and a kind of a story, a point, an aim. And if a passerby or a random on the street was to look at that action, they would know exactly what you were trying to say, exactly what you were trying to do. And this is something that can be really powerful because, you know, if you have a protest and it's really impossible to look at it and see anything other than what you're trying to say. So if all of the, you know, all of your banners and all of your flags have a certain message or a kind of variation on a certain message, if people are wearing a certain color, you know, if you're trying to, you know, protest against deforestation, say, you plant trees, and things like that, and it's just completely clear what you're trying to do. There's no mixed messaging. Like, this can be a really good way of regaining power and taking away that the ability of kind of the mass media to twist what we're trying to do and to make it into something it's not. And another way of doing this is just kind of taking the time before doing an action or doing an event or going to a protest or organizing a protest to think about what the media might spin it into. Because, you know, let's be honest, we all want good media coverage, and some, you know, there's some really amazing journalists and newspapers who really want to report on what's happening or report on the truth. But a lot of the time, what the media is looking for is a scandalous story, something that's going to gain headlines. So if they can spin things to be more scandalous, more intense, then a lot of the, especially like tabloid papers, they're going to do that. So if we kind of take that time beforehand to think, what could the media say about this that would put a negative frame on it? How are we kind of reinforcing a dominant view about animal justice activism? How can we make sure that what we're trying to say is really clear, really explicit, whether that's down to the speeches that are said, to the spokespeople that are chosen, who they are, what they're saying, what kind of, signs, again, like banners and all that kind of thing is there. Like, if we put thought into that beforehand, and which, you know, a lot of people do, and make sure that we have a plan of and an understanding of what frames might be being activated by what we're doing. So are we negating a frame that's really common and really explicit? Is there a way that we can change that? And the final thing that I want to say is that I think the key way, and the way that I really come across that's really powerful of approaching framing when you don't have that kind of resources and the power, is to create new frames. And I think the ideal, when we kind of thinking about creating new frames, is an idea of visioning. So a lot of the time when we think about the world and we're kind of, you know, involved in social justice work, what we do is we think about what all that is bad with the world and how we stand in opposition to it. So, you know, we're against animal exploitation, we're against, you know, eating animals, we're against this, we're against that. And what happens then is that we often end up just constantly talking about everything that's wrong with the world and reinforcing everything that's wrong with the world, because we're never getting that chance to imagine and to vision and to show others what the world that we want, what the world we imagine could be. So I think something that is really kind of powerful for me, and that I've seen be really effective in Animal Rebellion and other organizations as well, is visioning a different future, which is also kind of aligned with creating a new frame, and rather than being in opposition to something, being in support of something. So an example of this was last year in October, Animal Rebellion went to Smithfield Meat Market, which is a massive market in the middle of London, which is kind of an iconic center of, they've been, selling animals' bodies for many decades, I think hundreds of years, and it's kind of this iconic institution. And originally the plan was to go and shut the place down for a number of weeks. And then they end up talking to Smithfield, and they end up negotiating to go there for one night. But what they did was they transformed it into a fruit and veggie market of the future. And what they did there was, rather than going and standing in opposition against the frame, an idea, which was, an idea of using animals, an idea of eating animals, rather than being in opposition to that, and then just having a conversation about, why do vegans think this is the normal way of doing things, and kind of having that adversarial conversation. Instead, they started a new conversation, which is, why couldn't the world look like this? This is a potential future. This is another way that we could live. So I think it can be really easy to get stuck in this idea that we are not powerful, and that we have to just be fighting all the time, and fighting what the dominant society is saying, and what they're saying about animals, what they're saying about nature, what they're saying, and that we have to constantly be saying, they're wrong, they're not listening to the science, they're not thinking about, they don't understand how animals resist. We need to tell them, we need to make sure people know. And sometimes what can be even more powerful is showing a different way, and making that really strong and really powerful, and creating our own frames and our own stories. So yeah, I will wrap it up there. And I'm going to post a reading list if people are interested, or some more resources in the chat, if people want to take that further. Yeah, I think, sorry, I'm just getting the list, and then I'll just say something to finish up. So I think that went there. Yeah, there you go. So there's some links there to some kind of further reading on both action planning for kind of story-based actions, as well as framing. There's a lot more that I could have talked about. It's not much time, but I'm really grateful to kind of have this chat opportunity to just kind of give a brief overview of some of the work that I do. It's a bit of a ramble, but yeah, thank you all so much for letting me share. And I hope it starts some discussions about how we can use language strategically for animal justice, and how we can kind of rethink the way we create stories.
Well, thank you so much, Harley. This has been a very fruitful conference. And on my part, I have a few questions, and I just wanted to tell everyone, so if you have any questions, please write them down in the conversation below. It says talk or converse. I don't know what it says in English. Mine is in French. And as well, if you're interested, you can ask a live question by raising your hand, if you don't mind being on video. So I had one question, and maybe this will bring other questions in mind. So I was wondering, how can you know what is a good or a bad framing? You talked a bit about framing, and you use this powerful metaphor of the picture. Depending on what we see or cues, we will have a different understanding in our heads, even though it's the same element, which is part of the bigger story. So yeah, can you tell us a bit about how is someone supposed to know how to do that, or how to recognize a good or a bad framing?
Yeah, definitely. I would definitely want to answer that. Before I do, I want to apologize if I seem a bit spaced out. It's because I'm currently in London and the rebellion starts on Tuesday. So I'm in massive action planning mode. So if you're in London and want to join the rebellion, please do. But yeah, I want to apologize for that. It's also a bit late here, but yeah, I'm very happy to be here. So if I don't seem like that, I am. Yeah, so good or bad framing? I think it's a really, really good question. So it's hard because it's something, you know, we're all really still learning. And you know, it's sometimes it's trial or error, but I think kind of a really good way of going about it that's a lot of the time going to be an easy way in is to kind of start a conversation about framing by thinking about values. So there's a thing which I wish I could share, but I don't know what it's called. But essentially, it's a bit of it's a circle, and it has kind of human values on it, like societal values. And you know, there's some values that we think of about being universal, which you know are shared in a lot of different places, and they might be things like truth, respect, compassion, kindness. Then there's some which are, you know, kind of local values, like you might be in a town or even smaller than that. So, you know, I don't know if people went to like schools that had like mottos and things like that. Like I remember when I went to like at my school, there'd be things up on the wall that would be like, you know, respect, trust, all that kind of thing. And we had like 5, which were our school kind of values. So I imagine, you know, if I was to go back to my school, my high school, and do a protest there, then I would frame that protest using those values, because then if, you know, people were trying to be like, oh, well, you know, you shouldn't be protesting about this, then I would be saying, well, the reason is because what is happening is against our values. So values are kind of a really strong way to approach framing. So things can be, yeah, on different levels, as I said. So, you know, I think in the UK, for instance, something that we use a lot in Animal Rebellion is this idea, which is kind of repeated a lot, is that the UK calls itself like a nation of animal lovers. And that's like a really strong value that, you know, we take care of animals, we, you know, we don't treat animals badly. So that's kind of like a really strong value that's kind of embedded into like the UK culture. So it's like when we're talking about like creating a frame for an action, then we can base things on those values. So if you're kind of, and that's a good way of like testing a frame as well. So if it's like, if you are trying to, you know, plan an action or even think of a slogan, because honestly, a lot of framing is communicated through catchy slogans. Like it's true. There's a place in America that's called the Center for Story-Based Strategy. And basically their whole job, they're amazing. But what they do is they work with social movements. And a lot of what they do is create memes. Like they're a really, you know, like kind of forward-thinking, revolutionary organization, but they create memes for social movements, because that is a lot of the way that, you know, like internet memes, a lot of the way that framing is communicated is through, you know, sound bites, catchy slogans, like tax relief, things like that. Animal Rebellion, we have just and sustainable plant-based food system. Like, so when we're kind of, you know, creating things like that, a good way to test them is be like, does this trigger, you know, values of compassion, justice, kindness, or is it kind of triggering values, like different values, or is it triggering no values? Is it just about hate and anger? So yeah, like when we're thinking about good or bad framing, honestly, like the best way is to test things. So another group called PERC, which does story-based strategy work, again for social movements, they have a testing guide, and what they say is any testing is better than no testing. So if you have an idea and you're like, you know, oh, this would be a great campaign, And it's like, you know, you have a name for the campaign, you have a target for the campaign, and then you're like, oh, I don't know if this framing is going to kind of have the reaction that I want. Even if you, yes, and any testing is better than no testing unless it's animal testing. Thanks, Peter. Very true. Yeah, so if you're like, you have this campaign, you're like, I don't, you know, I think this is a really great campaign. Even if you just kind of talk to a couple of people who aren't involved in animal justice and be like, hey, when I say this, like when I say this name or when I say this target, what do you think of? And like that first reaction, that's often your best kind of judge of how effective that frame is. Because a frame and a story and an action is kind of like a joke. If you have to explain it, it's probably not very good. So if you have to, if you say something like, you know, I came up with this great campaign and I have this slogan for it, and then I'm like, I say it to someone and they're like, oh, that makes me think of, you know, something really horrible. And I'm like, no, it's not that because of this. Then it's probably not a good frame. It kind of has to have that, you know, the first reaction has to be evoking positive values. Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, really just, yeah, values is a good way of going about it, I'd say. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. We have another question from Soren, who's asking, what are the elements to take into account when you want to frame an issue? So
Yeah,
how
awesome.
do you do it concretely?
Awesome. So I think it depends on, again, the layers. So, you know, there's different things that you take into account if you're developing framing for a campaign, say, which is quite a long extended thing, versus developing framing for an action, which is, you know, might be a discrete event, like a protest, versus, you know, developing framing for an entire organization, which is, you know, a really massive thing. So like when we're
For
developing
inaction, for example, maybe something, I know lots of people are into action, so I'm thinking maybe this is more accessible. If you have an example, that would be awesome.
Definitely. So kind of the way I go about it, so I used to, well, I'm part of the actions team in Animal Rebellion, and my role in that is story-based actions. So we have this, you know, we have a whole action planning checklist, and one of the first things that we do is we write a narrative for the action. And the way that we write this narrative is literally like you would write kind of a plot outline for a story. So I kind of set it up as, you know, you have your plot, and this is the action logic. So, you know, you have, what are you trying to achieve with this action? You know, are you trying to, like, what message are you trying to send? Like, if you had to kind of condense everything that you're trying to do into like one sentence, what would that sentence be? What is the aim? Because a lot of the time, you know, we think, oh, this will be such a great action, like we'll do this, it'll look so cool, it's going to be so awesome. And then we realize that, oh, I don't actually know why we're doing this, or like what specifically it's relating to. So I think starting off with what you're trying to achieve is like, yeah, the best way of doing it. And a lot of the time, you know, we'll be in meetings and we'll get into like, you know, halfway through, 3/4 of the way through an hour-long meeting, and we're brainstorming, and then someone will go, hang on a sec, why are we doing this? And the conversation will just slow down. But in the end, it's always really good, because then we don't, you know, just go out, or we do, but less often do we go out and do something that gets, you know, that we're just like, oh, we don't know why, I don't know why we did that. So I think starting with why you're trying to achieve, what you're trying to achieve, and why you're trying to achieve it. And then from that point, it's like, yeah, like creating a narrative for your action is really important, because it helps you kind of clarify that question again of like what you're trying to achieve and what the frame should be and what the frame can kind of respond to. So yeah, like I said, I kind of often lay it out when I'm planning actions like I'm writing a script. for something. So I'll write, you know, what the conflict is, who the characters are, and when like breaking that down into kind of, you know, the stereotypes of, you know, hero and villain, like who is the hero in this situation, who is the villain, break it down into like, you know, what is the setting, what's going to be the kind of climactic moment in this, and all that kind of thing. But usually kind of the key things that are often really, really useful, I think, when framing is, yeah, thinking about what are you trying to achieve, who are the characters, and what is the conflict. And that's often the three that I use when I'm planning an action. And
Harley,
then,
I'll interrupt you. I'm sorry.
yes, I saw there was another
We
question.
have only a few minutes left, maybe 4 minutes. I'll ask the last question here. If we
Yeah.
manage, we'll do our best. So, Steph Gravel is asking, we have communal values, but it seems like oppositional cultures and the dominant culture also have different values. Do you take that into consideration, or do you generally frame around your own values in hopes of swaying the dominant culture?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question. So I used to volunteer with an organization called the Australian Conservation Foundation, and they're the largest kind of environmental like NGO in Australia. And, you know, they're very kind of like, they're very popular with, you know, the kind of conservative middle class people who want to give money to a place that they kind of feel like is doing something good for the environment, but aren't, you know, doing the kind of activism themselves. And I remember going to a meeting about framing with them, and they talked about this, and they talked about how a lot of research was done into kind of this question of what values to activate, because you're completely right, like there are different values and different segments in society have different values. So, you know, there's values that are kind of, you know, values of compassion, there's values of family, and then there might be kind of values of like, you know, protection. So things like, you know, even like values of like, you know, when we're thinking about like, you know, financial growth and things like that, like that's kind of when people are, you know, engaged in these really awful industries that, you know, put profit over people, that's because of like a certain value set, which is often, you know, protection and, you know, comfort and all that kind of thing. So you're completely right in that there are lots of different values and the different segments of society hold different values. So what this research, and I'll try and find it and send it at the end, like kind of showed was that when you're kind of trying to change like people's minds, or trying to kind of move society in a certain direction, so like, you know, I don't know if people have heard of like the Overton window, which is often used in political context, which is essentially like there's this window of acceptable kind of thought, there's a window of like acceptable ideas. And as things happen in society, so as, you know, like protests and academia and just, you know, things move on and the years progress, that window slowly shifts to kind of make more things acceptable. Things that weren't acceptable 20 years ago are acceptable now. So the kind of what works most effectively to shift that window is appealing to people's values that aren't based on like themselves. So things that are about esoteric, kind of more spiritual values. And when I say spiritual, I mean like things like compassion, kindness, those kind of things. When you activate those, which, like, you know, we often kind of think of it, I guess, the selfless versus the selfish side of someone, or the, you know, world focused versus individual focused. When we kind of message or talk to people in a way that activates those, like those kind of higher values, like of compassion and kindness, rather than those like survival values of like protectiveness, of like protection and like comfort, and, you know, trying to earn enough money so you don't have to think about, like, worry about the future. That's actually kind of a way to that's the kind of the most effective way to make people change, because like it's kind of, you know, we know that like when people are thinking about survival, you know, like, you know, earning enough money, having a place to live, you know, then they're not really thinking about, they're not kind of in a mindset to have their minds change or to open their minds. Whereas when people are thinking about things like kindness and compassion, which are values which are kind of beyond survival, they're beyond self-protection and family protection, they're kind of in a more kind of universal sense, then people remain like they kind of become more open to things that don't seem as acceptable when they're in a different mindset, if that makes sense. So when we talking about framing, we're usually trying to appeal to those kind of higher values. So those values that are more about universal thought rather than kind of individual, like living kind of day by day. If that makes sense.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it's very useful to know how you can actually understand the mindset to bring it to your advantage. And so we have one last question, I think. I saw someone who said.
Yeah, it was me.
Okay, yes, sorry.
I will try to like say this one out loud because it's a little too complex for my own self to understand. So please excuse me if it's not clear. I'll place a bit of context. So observing around me, I've observed a lot of polarization and tribalism and activists in all the activism, everywhere around us, and the difficulty of making sense. And to build on what you just said now with like the different set of values, and to also build on what you were doing with the picture of the beach and like the different, like how can we, or is it even possible to reframe the story? So instead of, well, I'm not even instead. So, because I think that you're like, you know, like if we focused on something, then we'll have, but how is it possible to reframe it more globally so that it englobes all of the different stories so that we don't embark into a narrative warfare between different conflicting values? And I mean, I can give two easy examples. Like one of them came into one of our other conferences before. It was in French. I don't think you're there. And it was a conflict of values between two progressive movements that we know of. So like between feminism and transgender, and there's like a conflict of values between like, so how can we, I mean, I can think of one very easily from the vegan movement too, but I'm not going to go there. But how is it, do you understand my question? Is it clear enough?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think it's a really, really good question. And it's a hard thing as well, because we often, you know, we're trying so hard to, you know, go in opposition to a system that is like, you know, really powerful and really strong. And it's often, you know, really hard because we're not united in that. And, you know, a lot of the time I think like one of the reasons like the political right is so powerful is that like they're a lot more united than the left. And it's, you know, they're united behind really horrible things, but a lot of the time they are a lot more united, and it can be really hard. So like, I completely understand, I think, what you're talking about, like with trying to frame something as like a global kind of idea. So it's not like we have, you know, animal justice frames here, then we have, you know, another kind of social issue frames over here. It's like kind of this kind of idea of like this being kind of a whole frame of like social justice. Is that what I'm kind of getting?
Yes, kind of, but actually
yes, and
being more global than that. So not right or left, like everything.
Yeah, definitely. So I think this is a really important conversation. It's something that I think about quite a lot. because it's like the dream is that we're going to all unite behind this vision of this is what the world should be like. And it's like, I think I see this happening. I see it happening on a micro scale rather than a kind of macro scale. So I'll explain that. I think like, you know, I don't really see it happening in the sense that like we might all unite behind one shared vision of this is what, you know, this is the shared value set. This is exactly what things are going to look like. But I do see that a way of doing that is to kind of find those areas of commonality, which I think every group shares, and trying to kind of like push them and unite behind them, and kind of also like a culture of tolerance as well. Kind of trying to embody that and bring that into our movement. So it's like we're not at the moment, definitely as well, we're not all going to agree. And so if we can kind of find those areas of commonality, and there's this thing which is called like, so Otpor, which is a Serbian resistance movement, they talked about like lines of division. And it's like, so when you're building a campaign, say, or when you're building a movement, you try and find an issue that like most people support. And then like there's only kind of a few kind of people who people think are not very good, who are in opposition to it. And it's like when you have that, it kind of starts to surpass things like, you know, party lines or, you know, social justice issues, because it's something that everyone is kind of supporting or in opposition to. So I think like that's the way I see forward. And I think it's a really complex kind of topic, and I feel like we could talk about this for another hour, because I think it is really complex. That's the way I see forward, is like trying to find, like, as our groups, kind of as our groups, and then hoping that people in their groups will start doing this as well, is starting to like, yeah, look for areas of commonality rather than areas of difference, see what we can like get behind together. So like, for example, Animal Rebellion recently did like a joint protest with farmers, which was protesting the UK agriculture bill. And that was like, it was kind of a big moment for us as Animal Rebellion to be like, I think this is one of the first times that we can think of in recent UK history that animal activists have, you know, united and done a protest in like solidarity with farmers. And like, we were there, we were invited by this farming group. It was called Save British Farming. There was a lot of tractors, and you know, there was discomfort there, because it was like, well, like some of the stuff that we stand for is really in opposition to you, but some of the stuff is really in support of you. And in that case, it was an example of like two groups putting aside those differences and being like, we have a shared vision, and we can get behind that. And that kind of gave me hope, seeing kind of things like that. And I think if we start to see more examples of that, and more kind of examples of like groups and people reaching out beyond their own kind of circles, I think that's only going to grow, the more kind of times we see it. And I think, you know, it's never going to be kind of a snap thing of like, you know, this is like one thing and everyone's going to get behind. Like we see that sometimes, like, you know, I think we see that sometimes when a whole bunch of groups suddenly go behind something. You know, people have done like reading on social change. We see like moments of the whirlwind, where suddenly it seems like everyone is getting behind an issue. You know, we saw that this year with like Black Lives Matter protests, and suddenly it seemed like, you know, group divides, societal divides didn't matter anymore, and everyone was getting behind this issue. But I think like in the long term, the way I see us kind of creating that global thing is just to, like in something that we can do, in like people in this who are kind of making the effort to come to these spaces and trying to, you know, learn. It's something we can bring back of like, how can we kind of seek that commonality rather than that divide? And how can we kind of reach out to maybe a group who we think is in opposition to us, and find what we share something on. if that makes sense. Because when we start to find those things that we share with those in like extreme opposition to us, then like it's probably likely that that will be something that is shared quite like universally. That yeah, that's a bit of a ramble, but I think it's a really big topic and something that I think is really important to keep talking about. Yeah.
Thank you.
No worries.
Well, I think we've come to the end. We actually
Little bit
we've done it by 5 minutes, but we didn't even feel it because it was very, very interesting. So thank you so much, Harley, for staying up that late. I mean, I think how late is it at your place? Or
11:06 p.m.
Yeah.
It's not too late.
Still, thank you so much. It was very enlightening. Sorry, very, very interesting to hear all of that. And I definitely recommend all the books and references that Harley put just before, including the book "Don't Think of an Elephant." It's I read it. Very, very interesting angles. Talks about communication and how to be more effective in our messaging. And so thank you very much. Thank you so much to everyone. Thank you to Projet Méduse, our partners, and as well as Nobby Radio, and all of you today who are here, and you could be watching whatever TV, sports, you could be sleeping or watching cute cat videos, but no, you decided to stay here and learn, and I think this is very valuable. That's how we will become more effective and be better voices for the animals. So this is the end of the first day of the first edition of the Little Anti-Species webinars in company of Harley. We are very grateful and have a nice end of day or beginning of day, depending on where you are in the globe. So thank you so much. And don't forget to, if you're interested, if you want to be part of the collective of Vegan Option Canada. If you're not in Canada, but you still want to contribute, there is no problem. You can go on our website. We will put it a bit, everything which is there will change a bit. We are in the major restructuration, working towards a plant-based food system. So have a nice day, good night, good morning. À la prochaine.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And don't forget that Harley will be back tomorrow on our closing panel of discussion with 5 other panelists.
Yes, at what time, Sarin?
So it will be exactly at about this time, I think, that the panel will start. And we will have Stephanie Gravel, Daniel Kidby, Silas Rao, Remo Serna, and the moderator will be Will Tuttle. So please join us for that discussion. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.